Dear friends, today I thought I'll spend some time to explain why I was not interested in any of these so-called minor parties in the past, and why Australia was very well managed compared to other countries. For we have in Australia a thing called the Guide to Regulation and regulation making process that is embedded in the legislation. The process involves a very rigorous examination of every policy. And that's why economists are hired in the government. And that's one of the jobs I was doing to assess the cost benefit analysis of different political parties. And in my view, both the Liberal and Liberal parties broadly were following good practice until this COVID pandemic. So there was no reason for me to even dream of, thinking of joining a so-called minor party. But since the March 2020 pandemic, these basic concepts have been abandoned by the Liberal and Labour parties, which is now forcing us to essentially start effectively a new party. Now, Australian Federation Party has been built upon the merger of many other parties in the past. And the most recent party to merge was Australia's Representatives, that was founded by Peter and myself in starting of the discussions in March 2020, and we did the work in April 2020, leading to almost the complete registration of Australia's representatives by June or July last year, at which stage, as you're aware, the laws changed, and therefore we had to then think of other options. So we merged into the Australian Federation Party. Things have moved very rapidly. I haven't had time to, and I was in India. My father was unwell and he's died. I was in India for 6 months, and so things have been very last-minute things happening in this, Australian Federation Party. I want to run you through the policy framework that was designed for the Australia's Representatives Party. This framework is actually the same as that of the framework that is used by the Liberal and Labour parties. It is also the standard policy of Australia. There's only a slight few additions to this particular framework to ensure that we listen to the people more actively, and that we also pay more importance to freedom. So I want to run us through this particular policy framework, which I hope will be adopted by the Australia's Federation Party in due course. This framework will allow all policies of Australian Federation Party to be assessed on the basis of reasonability, necessity, and practicability. So let me run you through this very quickly. This was something I made on 1 July 2021. We never got to publishing it in Australia's Representatives website. Things were still under process at that stage. And now I want to run you through this thing. So the first thing is we need to define what is the main function of the government. And the foundational role of the government is defense, police, and justice. So that's the first order function. And for that particular function, which we agree is the job of the government, we have less of a requirement of proof, but for all other things, we have a much higher requirement of proof. Second order functions are things like some kind of infrastructure support, and maybe, working with the private sector for that. Support for equality of opportunity, obviously. We must ensure that everybody has an equal opportunity in Australia. And elimination of dire poverty through the social minimum. And this also might include some functions related to the environment and things like town planning and so on, where people might have what you call negative externalities. So all other things, the government should really not play a role unless there's an absolutely strong justification. So that's about the general definition. Now, for every single policy, we would want to ask what would happen without the involvement of the government. So let's assume the government is very basic and minimal. It only does the night watchman role, which is that of the defense, police, and justice. It doesn't interfere in other things. It also ensures that private contracts are honored. And what would happen in that case? So that would be the base case. So we would need to do a lot of historical analysis in many cases, because we've not had situations where the government is not involved in things for a very long time. The government has now got involved in everything, but we need to go back to the time when it was not involved. There was no licensing, no registration, etc. What would happen? What are the harms, right? So the first thing is we need to identify the harms. And I've given some good description of the kinds of things, for example, in the book The Beautiful Tree by James Tooley, he looks at the time when the government was not involved in schools, and so what happened then, and so on. And Walter Block has a wonderful study of roads, for example. Even today in France, 76% of the roads are managed by the private sector. Trains are operated privately in Japan, and so on. So there's a lot of need to examine what would happen in the absence of a government. Okay. Then we would want to identify what exactly are the real problems with this. Why is this a problem? That's called a so-called market failure in many cases. So what exactly is the market failure in this situation? We would then want to ask the third question, which is the first principles test, back to the original function, idea of the first and second order functions. Should the government be involved in this kind of thing at all? I mean, there might be some problems in the market, but does it mean that the government should get involved at all? Should people not be doing this on their own? And so that kind of a question needs to be addressed very thoroughly before considering the role of a government. Assuming that there is some kind of a role, a preliminary assumption that there might be a role for the government, then the fourth question is, what exactly can the government do? So that would be the options analysis. And so we will look at the kinds of things, light-handed approaches versus heavy-handed approaches. The COVID pandemic is a good example where the government could have taken the light-handed approach, which was a targeted approach where the elderly would be looked after, but the others would carry on their life with a bit of precautions, versus what we did is that everybody was stopped, from doing what they do, and that led to the lockdowns and havoc caused in Australia. So what are the options? The light-handed options, the modest, reasonable options, and the heavy-handed options. We need to identify that. We also need to be aware the idea of, that the government knows best. I think I'll just show you this little book which I had here. Yeah, so this is, I don't think this book is visible here. Sorry, it might be visible, yes. It is Hayek's book, The Fatal Conceit. The idea that the government can actually have the kind of knowledge necessary to deal with problems is one of the most absurd ideas, and that's explored in this book. But even those with experience of the government know that it's very rare that the government has the kind of knowledge to deal with these things. So what we need is to allow the people's knowledge to enter the picture and to be maximized and to be used wherever appropriate. So that's where we should shun the heavy-handed approaches and look at market solutions. What is a market solution? When people directly offer to get involved. They have knowledge that we must use. And so that is where the options come in. We must consider the options based on the best possible, the limited engagement or limited intervention options. And remember, the base case is always the first option. That is we should not be in a situation where the government goes and messes up things worse than they would have been otherwise. And that's what happened with the COVID pandemic. If the government had done actually nothing, we would have had a better outcome by far than what we've done in this particular case. But of course, we should have done something, and that's where we have a targeted approach. But remember, the baseline is the market without the government intervention. And so that's always the first option. Then I think this is one thing that the current, Victorian government regulation, guide to regulation, other documents don't really consider adequately, is the emphasis on freedom. We need to really understand whether any of these options involve the government interfering in people's freedom and in their property rights. So, for example, somebody has got a business and you shut it down. That's a big interference in property rights. Okay, so there is a very fundamental issue here to consider and identify in the options the kinds of losses of freedom and property rights that might be involved with various options. And that is one of the most significant things that I believe the Australia's representatives was going to do. And for example, I gave the example of the land seized from Aborigines in Australia. Now, of course, you take land from the Aborigines and give it to a large, other people, then the benefit of that is higher by the people who benefit from that land than the Aborigines, who are much fewer in number. But it's not enough to just consider that very utilitarian analysis. You need to bring in the idea of restricting the attacks on people's freedoms and property rights. So that would be a very important analysis to be conducted in any policy, that we don't seize people's lands and we don't seize their property rights and restrict their freedoms. Remember, for each of the options, you need to also consider why things might go wrong. And there are two ways by which things might go wrong. It's not just about the issue of freedom being excessively taken away, but it's also the fact that market players are very intelligent. And so if you impose a policy which has got the ability for the smarter market players to actually game the policy and they game the system, then they will take an undue advantage of that policy. So we need to be very aware of that, identify it, and make sure that we don't allow the sabotage of the proposed policy by market players. And we know that, all the time it's happening. Pharma companies are, for example, they hijack the policy-making process through regulatory capture. So whatever policy is actually being created is being hijacked at the same time. And these are the kind of things we need to identify specifically in the questions that we ask. There are 10 questions. So the 7th question is another way to sabotage things. It's not just the market players, but it's also the government functionaries who can sabotage a policy. And this is actually very common as well. Although the government would never admit to it, but it's actually one of the most common ways of sabotaging policy. And this is not just about corruption. They could simply be laziness. They could be indifference. They could be inefficiency, high cost of doing things. There could be groupthink, which is what happened with the COVID pandemic, that people wouldn't even think sensibly. So the policy making process was contaminated with groupthink and so on. So we need to be, therefore, we need to ask for independent scrutiny of these kind of proposals so that all these flaws in the implementation are identified. That's the practicability test. Finally, we also need the 8th question, which is, has this kind of thing ever been done before? And if so, what was the impact of that policy? And that's a real experience test. So once we have all that done, then let's say one of the policies, or maybe two, are shortlisted out of the options for further work. That's not the end of the decision. The further work has to be done. And then we do cost-benefit analysis. We can do a mathematical economic model to start the whole journey of the cost-benefit analysis. We should do also a proper CBA, a utilitarian analysis. And after doing that, if we find that there is actually a net benefit from the proposed policy, that's an improvement to the baseline. Remember the baseline where the government does nothing? So let's say after all this analysis, we come to the view that yes, if the government does these things, then there's actually a significant improvement to the society. And there's a very minimal restriction on freedoms as part of this particular process. Then and only then can we actually agree to this particular policy. And finally, of course, it's not good enough to have a policy. You need to actually have a transitional arrangement from the current system to the new policy. That's a lot of work where people actually fail and therefore the implementation goes awry. So this, by the way, is based on absolutely rock solid standard analytical procedures followed by the Liberal and Labour parties, and I do not wish us to go anywhere else. This is what I would hope would be followed in the Australia's representatives, Australian Federation Party as well. I thought I'll just quickly give you a rundown of what it means, and this is how, when people propose policy for Australia's Federation Party in the future, we would want to have this kind of a proof of the suitability of a policy. We just don't want to jump in and say, okay, we'll do this and we'll do that. No, we should rather not do things. A party that doesn't want to do things is probably much better than a party that wants to do everything under the sun, because in doing so, it will actually engage in what is called the fatal conceit. The thing that you will find most common in the people who think they know what is best for us as common people is that they are very conceited. They have the belief that they know everything and they are perfect. And such people are very dangerous. And we should avoid any such people in Australian Federation Party. We need people who are humble, who say that we are full of error. And let's therefore do a discussion and let's do a debate. And let's have a complete question-answer session. Let's run through the details. Let's not rush to the conclusion in any policy. So while we're starting the party, the Australia's Federation Party, I hope this particular policy-making framework and process that was designed for Australia's representatives to make it an absolutely world-best party in terms of its policy process. We are not supposed to rush into any policy. That's the basic thing. And we're supposed to listen to people. That's why there's a community pact that was committed to. We'll listen to the people. We will not rush to conclusion. We will allow the members freedom of choice. We will have debate. We'll have discussion. These are the things that we didn't get with the Liberal and Labour Party, which also didn't follow these best practice policy frameworks. And so they became a kind of a Nazi party. Dictators like Morrison and Albanese sitting at the top and Dan Andrews dictating what others will think. Not really. This is not what we want. We want a complete debating. It's a debating forum. It's a public debating forum. But in each case, the policy, these questions should be asked. And once we agree that these are the kind of questions that all policies should address, and not a single unnecessary intervention should be made. When we say we want to help business, what has happened? The government has been intervening unnecessarily in businesses for the last so many years. Environmental regulation is a good example of excessive environmental regulation, excessive interference. Similarly, with the COVID, there was absolutely excessive and onerous requirements on business, which made so many businesses collapse. So we can't be just saying we will help businesses. We actually have to tell them that we will not be interfering in your business. And we will follow a system by which we are letting you do what you're good at, and we don't have the conceit or the arrogance to think that we know better than you. All we're saying is we'll listen to you. We want co-regulation wherever possible. We want to work on regulation along with industry, along with business. We don't want to impose things. We want to listen to people, community, and we want to have a logical, sensible policy that's based on a very systematic analysis. It's not reckless. And it is not based on dictatorship of people like Scott Morrison and others who say, let's shut the whole society down. That's not what this party is all about. All right. Thank you so much. I just thought I'll just do this today. And over the course of time, I'll give examples of how this policy framework might work in some cases and how this Australian Federation Party could consider this framework and also develop such policies in the future which are completely consistent with this framework. That means there is a full-fledged document that supports any policy of the Australian Federation Party. And these are not pulled out of the hat. They are completely logical. They are evidence-based. They intervene minimally with the lives of the people. So that would be, in my view, a good political party for Australia and for any other country in the world as well. So that's where a good policy framework should decide what we do. All right. Thank you very much.